delighted this morning to welcome everyone to this joint book discussion, which is being hosted by the EmptyNesters and the Women of Washington Hebrew Congregation together. We were hoping that we'd be in person, but as we all know, we're slowly coming to that back in person place, and wonderfully have had some opportunities in the last weeks to do that. Last week we had a fabulous Purim celebration. It was nice to see many of you there. Some of you I know are regulars at Torah study, and we've been able to see you there and at services. We actually saw some of you down in Florida this past week for our annual winter concert, and it was great to see you all there as well. Those who are there, and to be able to have more opportunities coming up. And so wonderful to have you join us this morning. We are very grateful to the Jewish Book Council for making this partnership possible and connecting us with our speaker this morning, Ira Rosen. And I'm going to introduce him in just a minute, but before I fully introduce him, you can see him, I'm also placing in the chat a link through our WHC Mitzvah Mall, a link to his book. And I encourage you, if you haven't already, yes.
There it is.
I encourage you to purchase, whether through the Mitzvah Mall or to go and head over to Politics and Prose or another independent local bookstore to support them. But certainly to a big part of our this ongoing series with the Jewish Book Councils, we love having the authors, even better when we are also able to read their books, whether before or after. So it's okay if you haven't read it yet, but I encourage you to pick up a copy and to get more of the behind the scenes. So today's really a treat. I know some of you often will say things to me like, you don't remember this, you're too young. I'm older than I look. And I grew up on 60 Minutes. That was what was on in my house. So we are so fortunate this morning to have Ira Rosen with us. And for nearly 25 years, Ira Rosen has produced some of the most memorable, important, and groundbreaking stories for 60 Minutes, many of which you can read about a little bit of more of the behind the scenes in his book. A former Neiman Fellow at Harvard University, Rosen was a senior producer of Primetime Live with Diane Sawyer. Ira Rosen has won 24 national Emmys, 4 DuPont Awards, 2 RFK Awards, and 2 Peabodys for his work. Not too shabby. He is co-author of The Warning: Accident at 3 Mile Island. I do remember that as well. His current book is Ticking Clock, again, you can see, in which he shares his experiences at 60 Minutes and really gives you the no holds barred behind the scenes look at what life was like there. And so today we have this opportunity to talk with him and to hear not just, Ira, not just your perspective, but maybe what you learned in the process as well. So I just want to start by thanking you for being with us. And we're so happy that you're able to make this possible and be with us, even from Florida.
Right.
So.
Thank you, Rabbi. So what I want to give a little bit of a background, because people often ask what producers do. And for 53 years, 60 Minutes has been on the air, and it's been the show that most Americans have relied on to stay informed. Its willingness to challenge authority has impacted the public consciousness, and it invented TV investigative journalism, including the use of hidden cameras and confrontational interviews to tell its stories. Today, we see there's this huge dilution of news with thousands of potential news sources. But in its heyday, the only TV news magazine was 60 Minutes, with a viewership that each week rivaled the TV audiences of a Super Bowl. Now, as a producer on 60 Minutes, there were about 24 of us. We were responsible for finding the stories, researching the stories, and putting them together. And those powers gave you the powers to be like Superman, because we were able to convince whistleblowers, con men, mob bosses to tell their stories. But more importantly, we righted the wrongs of society. We got the wrongfully convicted out of jail. We exposed the plight of farm workers, VA hospitals, crooked congressmen, doctors that were adept at ripping off insurance, and those who were greedy and made a lot of money on the opiate epidemic. And that was pretty much one of my stories that I did for 2 years, in the last 2 years that I worked there. And the stories we did sort of showed how Congress was protecting the drug companies and allowing them to send this drug out into every pharmacy in the country. So when we began at 60 Minutes, we were crusaders, we were muckrakers, and we were celebrated. We were defined as the fifth estate of government because of the fact that we could right the wrongs of society. But more importantly, 60 Minutes, when we began at 60 Minutes, and the hallways consisted of Mike Wallace, Morley Safer, Dan Rather, Ed Bradley, Harry Reasoner. I mean, it was literally like a New York Yankee lineup from the 1930s with Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig. And it was one after another, and they were incredibly competitive with each other. They would steal, there wouldn't be, a day wouldn't go by when they weren't either trying to steal stories or doing stories or jumping on planes. And I was talking to a friend yesterday. I mean, the old 60 Minutes, you would have found Mike Wallace and his producer, me, in Moscow today, trying to get the interview with Putin. Just like Mike did the interview with the Ayatollah Khomeini at the height of the hostage negotiations and crises. And that's what made the show really special. So Mike would have been in Moscow, Rather or Morley would have been in Kiev, trying to get the interviews there. And there was a real competition and hustle that went on. But what I learned when I began, the thing that I learned the most is the art of storytelling. And it's a kind of a lost art today. Everybody's tweeting, yes, no, maybe. And people have forgotten the art form of having conversations. There's a movie when I used to teach the art of the interview at various schools. I used to point to a movie called My Dinner with Andre. And it's two people having a conversation for 2 hours, and it's absolutely riveting. And it's one comment leads to another comment to another. And that's really the art form of doing a great interview. And during the period of time that I was at 60 Minutes, Mike Wallace and I did some extraordinary interviews. Later on, I had the good fortune to work with Leslie Stoll and Bill Whitaker, who also are fantastic interviewers. But some of the interviews that Mike and I did were amazing, just to put the word. One of the interviews we did, and I was thinking about this today. The last time I was in Moscow was when I went to see Andrei Sakharov. Andrei Sakharov was the great Russian dissident, inventor of the Soviet H-bomb, and we were doing a story about Edward Teller. And Teller really wanted us to go to Moscow to interview Sakharov. And you have to remember and try to put yourself in this period of time in the 1980s. We as 60 Minutes producers had an unlimited budget. We could just go to the airport today and fly anywhere on the planet we wanted to, as long as you have a passport and a visa, I guess. And I did that. I jumped a plane, went to Moscow, and saw Andrei Sakharov, who had agreed to do an interview. Mike Wallace came the next day, and we went up to his flat in Moscow, and it was a remarkable apartment to see. All the Soviet Jewish dissidents were in this apartment. Elena Bonner answered the door and said, and it was like a safe haven because he had won the Nobel Prize, and the officials were not going to mess with him. They didn't want the bad headlines that would happen. So people would come there and talk about changing society, reforming the system, and also how to help Soviet Jewry. And I remember during this period of time, most synagogues had some sort of actions to try to help Soviet Jewry. We don't hear about this very much now, but this was a very, very big issue at the time. And Andrei Sakharov's apartment was the center of that in many ways in Moscow at that time. So when we went to knock on his door, Elena Bonner, who did not suffer fools gladly, put a finger in Mike Wallace's face and said, "You make sure you bring him back by 3 o'clock, otherwise I'm going to lock him out." And he said, "Yes, Mrs. Bonner." Now, you have to understand that Mike Wallace was a guy who liked to do what people say he shouldn't do. So if you tell him to bring him back at 3, there was no way Mike was going to bring him back at 3. So we went off to the CBS bureau and we sit down. We start doing the interview. We have our CBS translator there, and we ask him about how the Soviets were able to build the H-bomb and whether the Rosenbergs were really helpful in this regard. And he kind of waves his hand. The Rosenbergs had nothing to do with it. What we used to do is we'd go out into the snows of Siberia after U.S. above ground nuclear tests, and we waited for the fallout to come over the land. And when the fallout would come down, we would go into the snows and then be able to figure out the components of the U.S. nuclear bombs. Groundbreaking material, incredible stuff. It was so groundbreaking, in fact, that the CBS translator refused to translate because he thought they were revealing national secrets. So Sakharov spoke in English, which he very, very rarely spoke, and told us that story. And we had a great interview, and afterwards Mike said, "You want to go to Red Square?" And Sakharov had never been to Red Square in decades. It was a symbol of the power that was there, and he wasn't going to acknowledge it. But he decided that day to go there. And so we go into Red Square, and they're taking pictures, and I look at my watch, I say, "Oh my God, it's almost 3 o'clock." Anyway, we get back in the car, we show up about 3:30. Sure enough, Elena Bonner locked Dr. Sakharov out of the apartment, and there is the great Dr. Sakharov sitting on a stoop, waiting for his wife to get home. And it was a very, very poignant moment that this revolution was going on, and he couldn't even get into his own apartment at that time. And Mike and I would have many adventures along those lines. And one of the stories we did was a story about the gangster Joe Bonanno. And Joe Bonanno was head of the organized crime at the time and had retired to Tucson. And when I first approached Joe about doing the story, I wanted him to talk about, murders and killings and all this stuff, and they didn't want to talk about that. But what he did decide to talk about was the commission, and that was the Organized Crime Commission that was at the center of it. Unbeknownst to him, and I think his lawyers, Rudy Giuliani, who was U.S. attorney at the time in New York, was watching the show and decided to bring a RICO action right after he saw that against all the major crime families. But none of that was known at that particular time. But the most interesting part of that day was what happens after the correspondent leaves. And Mike Wallace went back to the airport, and Bonanno and I go grab a cognac in the back, and we're talking. And I said, Joe, as a Jewish kid growing up in New York, the two people who I really looked up to in a weird way was Sandy Koufax and Meyer Lansky. What was it about Lansky that was so good? Was he that really good with money and business? And he said, "What are you talking about?" He had the picture. The picture? What picture? He said the picture of J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, and Clyde Tolson, his deputy, having sex together. And we had the picture, and for years, Hoover always denied the existence of organized crime. So never happened. And I think now, looking back, the reason was he was worried about Lansky having this particular picture. And they used it as a blackmail chip for years, according to what Joe Bonanno said. And so these are the conversations you get when the cameras aren't going. The other thing I asked them is, who killed JFK? And he said, well, we wanted to take him out in Miami, but we ended up taking him out in Texas. And this had to do with the fact that he reneged on the promises he made in the 1960 election when the mafia helped him win West Virginia and Chicago. And now suddenly his brother, Robert Kennedy, is going after organized crime. And so he said when the assassination happened, he called down to Santos Trafficante, who was the head of organized crime in southern Florida, and he said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Don't worry about it. New York is absolved of this. Florida and Louisiana will take the heat." And Louisiana was run by Carlos Marcello. So Carlos Marcello and Trafficante, according to Bonanno, collaborated on the assassination. Now, when you as a reporter hear information like this, you just don't run to the presses and put it in the newspaper. You have to obviously absorb it and check it out and see. A lot of times that I've discovered in covering the mafia is they like to make up stories, and it helps make them bigger and better. And sometimes you really don't know what the ultimate truths are. And in covering organized crime for many years, I've asked that question, who killed Kennedy, to a number of big shots. And I never really got the same answer. So what happens is there's an involvement in this. Is it possible that the organized crime was involved in the assassination? Absolutely. Is it definitive so that I feel like I could now go in front of US Congress and tell the story? No. So this is what a producer does. The producer, yes, you could get excited. Getting excited is good, but you don't want to run and put it in the papers or television until you could have a chance to check it out. And one of the stories that I did that still is a great mystery to me today was the story of Israel's greatest spy. And it was a guy named Ashraf Marwan. Now, Ashraf Marwan is in Israel considered a national hero, to be the greatest spy. He was the son-in-law of Abdul Nasser, and sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, he decided to be a walk-in to the London bureau of the Mossad. And he started turning over reams of material, which he was charging the Israelis about $100,000 for every time they met. But the Israelis believed it was totally worth it. He was giving them the order of battle. He's giving them parachute drops in the Sinai. He's giving them inside conversations between Sadat and the Russian counterparts. It was described to me when I was in Israel as a gold mine of material. But he also was giving them an early warning when war would start. And in 1973, before the Yom Kippur War, he had told them that the war was going to start in September. Now, in Israel, when you get something like that, they call up the reserves. And these are people who are working in supermarkets and delis, and immediately they drop their smock and head to their assigned posts. And so he told them the war was going to start in September, and just based on what he told them, Golda Meir ordered everybody, all the reserves, to be called up. But it turned out that was not when the war began. So it was kind of like everybody got ready and then they decompressed. Now it's the beginning of Yom Kippur. And Marwan signals to Zvika Zamir, the head of the Mossad, gives him a code that the war is about to begin the next day. And Zvika flies to London that night, debriefs Marwan, and immediately sends a telex. Remember, there's no big computer systems here. Everybody's still working on the phones. That the war will begin the next day at sundown. Sure enough, the war began, but it didn't begin at sundown. It began at 2:00 in the afternoon, and that allowed the Egyptian army to cross the Suez Canal with minimal casualties. They expected about 25,000 troops to die in the crossing because they had built a wall of fire. It was really a fortified position. But because the Israelis felt they had a few hours and they didn't need to move all their front up immediately, the Egyptian army surprised them and was able to cross. And we all know the subsequent history of that. The Israelis feared the first couple days were horrible days. I still remember watching it, in horror when I was a student at Cornell. Eventually they turned it around. But how did the Israelis get so fooled? So it turns out that Marwan might have been, in fact, a double agent. That according to the person who ran military intelligence, that he was providing them with this false information in order to win the war. And it became a huge scandal in Israel. The head of the military intelligence was eventually found guilty of leaking information. Zvika Zamir and the Mossad circled around Ashraf Marwan and said he's the greatest spy, better than Eli Cohen, the greatest spy that Israel ever had. However, after his name surfaced, Marwan was killed. His body was thrown over a balcony in the St. James neighborhood of London. And now what happens? Did the Egyptians say he got what he deserved? No. What happened was Sadat sent, I'm sorry, now it was Mubarak. Mubarak sent his private plane to pick up the body, brought him back to Cairo, and 100,000 people lined up behind Marwan, including the head of the Egyptian intelligence service and the son of Mubarak, marching in front of this parade, celebrating this man who the Egyptians considered their greatest spy. So the question is, who was he really working for? The Israelis or the Egyptians? And I write about this in my book. And it became an incredible mystery for me. And I spent a lot of time there trying to sort it out. And I said, I want to meet his first handler, who was a guy named Shmuel Goren. And Shmuel Goren was kind of considered the James Bond of Israel intelligence. He had been the bureau chief in Paris for 30 years for the Mossad, a legendary figure in terms of getting information. And Zvika Zamir set it up. He said, go to a park bench in Ramat Gan. He told me where to go. And I went there and I sat down and I waited and I waited. And then a guy with kind of cargo shorts, short 5'5" guy with gray hair and looked a little bit actually like Meyer Lansky. And he comes up to me and he says, I hear you're looking for me. And I look at him with total surprise. And I said, you're Shmuel Goren? And he said, what were you expecting? And so he and I go off to a bench and we sit down. And for the next 2 hours, he told me some of the most extraordinary stuff of spycraft that I had ever heard. One of the stories he told me was that being stationed in Paris is the best assignment you could possibly have for all the reasons you could imagine. So he had to make sure that he continued to get information. So he went to his rival in the KGB. And he said, listen, you want to stay in Paris and I want to stay in Paris. How do we make this work for us? And so the KGB guy would leak him stuff and then Shmuel would leak him stuff. So it looks like they're really doing great things when in fact they're just drinking coffee, enjoying the day and making sure that their bosses won't send them home. It's not unlike that, I guess, in private industry. But in the end, the question was, who was he ultimately working for? And I think my determination was that when Ashraf Marwan began giving the information to the Israelis, getting paid very, very well for it, he was a genuine Israeli spy. And they had tested him along the way. And I go through some of those in my book. But then what happened was, I think the Egyptians discovered what he was doing. And Sadat said to him, here's the thing, I'm not going to kill you. I want you to do exactly what you're doing. And there'll be a moment in time where I'm going to ask you to deceive the Israelis. And sure enough, he continued to go to London to pick up his money. He continued to leak information. And then when the war happened, he deceived the Israelis about the start time. The Israelis were real apologists about this particular thing, saying, well, maybe he didn't get the last memo or something. But that's my belief about what happened to him. But as a producer at 60 Minutes, you get to meet characters like this and try to solve where the mystery really is. Now, I'm often asked, where did I learn how to tell stories as a producer? And the where I learned was working in the Catskill hotels as a kid. And I would be a busboy, a waiter. I worked at the Nemerson, the Windsor. I was the tennis pro at the Homoac Lodge. And the key to this is also that you also have to work the night lights in the casinos and in the nightclubs. And so I would work the lights for Henny Youngman and Jan Murray and Alan King. And through them, I learned the art of storytelling. Think of the great Henny Youngman joke. I'm going to take my wife to a place she's never been before. Pause. The kitchen. And so that has a beginning, middle, and end. It has a starting point. It has a motivation. It's telling you something about their relationship, all in one sentence. It's remarkable. And if you could translate that into a good story that has a beginning, middle, and end, and that ultimately ends up someplace where, you end up defining something, that's like a great Catskill joke. Anyway, I told this story at the very beginning and to Don Hewitt. But before I had a chance to talk to Don Hewitt, I almost didn't get my job at 60 Minutes. I had been, after graduating Cornell, I had been bouncing around to various newspaper jobs around the country, and I finally settled into a television job at WOR-TV. Now, WOR-TV was more known for $1 Million Movie than it was for having a news division. But I had done a story that apparently Don Hewitt had liked, and then he called my home. And I was living back in the house I had lived in high school in Fresh Meadows, Queens. And I was living with my parents. And this is what happened on one particular day. It's called the phone call. My path to 60 Minutes began on June 1980 when the phone rang at my parents' home at Fresh Meadows. "Is this the home of Ira Rosen?" the caller inquired. "Yes, who are you?" my mother replied. "I'm Don Hewitt, executive producer of 60 Minutes. "Oh yes, I read about you," my mother replied. "You have a lovely wife." "Thank you. What are you doing?" "I'm making a kugel," my mother said. "A kugel? God, I haven't had a good kugel in a long time," Hewitt said. "You come visit me, I'll give you a kugel," my mother offered. My mother Ethel was the quintessential Jewish mother, nagging, judgmental, someone with all the answers. "Actually, I'm looking for Ira," Hewitt said. "I'd like to see if he'd be interested in being a producer for 60 Minutes. "Oh, he's not interested. He's got a good job," my mother said. "Thanks anyway." I listened from across the room to the conversation, and I asked my mother who was on the phone. "Don Hewitt of 60 Minutes. He wanted to offer you a job, but I told him you already had one," she said. "How many jobs do you need?" I leapt from the chair and raced to the phone to call Hewitt back. Even though a few minutes had passed, he immediately picked up the phone. He was laughing. "I don't know about you, but I like your mother. If you don't want the job, tell her it's hers." But I wanted the job. And so the next day I went in to see Hewitt, and I told him the story about how I learned the art of storytelling in the Catskills. And he said, "That's the way I learned it." And he said, "This is great, but it doesn't matter if I like you. He has to like you." And the he was pointing to was Mike Wallace. And Mike Wallace at the time was the #1 correspondent on the #1 show in the country. And he acted the part, if you will. And so I would go there and sit down with him. And Mike would say, "Look at my resume." And he said, 6 months is not a lot of television experience to be a 60 Minutes producer. And he said, "I know what I could do for you. What could you do for me?" And it was a great question. And I really didn't have an answer. So I said, well, I was on the Cornell tennis team. I noticed that there was a tennis ball in his office. And he said to me later that he figured he could get 6 months of good tennis out of me before firing me. So he offered me the job. So I was so excited because I had been bouncing around newspapers to newspapers. And now suddenly I'm going to be Mike Wallace's producer on the hottest show on TV. And this is what happened when I called my mom. I walked out of the office dazed. I'd come from covering high school sports in Fresno, California, to becoming Mike Wallace's producer on the hottest show on TV. Not only was Mike the star, but I'd become the youngest producer they had ever hired. I called my mother to tell her, "Mom, I was just hired to be Mike Wallace's producer on 60 Minutes. Without missing a beat, my mom said, "Mike Wallace? He's so old. Why can't you work for Dan Rather?" Anyway, that's my dear mom. But Mike and I eventually did begin to work, and I did last longer than 6 months, and we bounced around and we did some extraordinary stories. But probably the story that I remember the most from the time I worked with him was the story we didn't do, and that was a profile of the actor Marlon Brando. And Brando at the time was the hottest actor. He was a recluse. If you remember, after The Godfather, he won an Academy Award and didn't go pick it up. He sent somebody else to pick it up. And he was a tough get. But after I did the Joe Bonanno story, he called me up and we began conversations. And Brando spoke Yiddish. And I learned Yiddish from my grandmother. And he learned his Yiddish from Stella Adler, the acting coach. And so we would chat in Yiddish, and I would call him up. Both of us were born on April 3rd. I'd call him up, wish him happy birthday. And he said, what is it with birthdays? He said, animals don't celebrate birthdays. Trees don't celebrate birthdays. Why do you feel a need to celebrate a birthday? I said, Marlon, I'm just calling you up to wish you a happy birthday. And this would go on for months. And then finally, my end game in this was always to try to get him to sit down with Wallace to go on camera. And so he finally agreed to have dinner with us, and we were out in Los Angeles, and he picks us up in a white Rolls Royce at the Beverly Hills Hotel. He's wearing a white suit. I mean, he looks amazing. Wallace gets into the front, I'm in the back, and Mike begins talking, and Mike says, I'm a little nervous. And Brando says, I am too. And I said, God, this is going so well. This is great. Until Brando starts driving his car. And he's driving his car down Mulholland Drive, and he's running every single red light. And I said, Marlon, what are you doing? And he said, why are you allowing a machine tell you what to do? Be a man. So somehow we got to this restaurant. We sit down, and Brando begins and says to Wallace, you're a great actor. He says, I'm not an actor, I'm a journalist. He said, oh, stop it. The way you raise your glasses, the way you look askance, the way you posture, you're one of the great actors. I've studied you. Mike's getting a little, agitated here. And he says, how did you get so fat? He said, well, I go to Baskin and Robbins and I can't decide what flavor I want. So I ask for a quart of everything they got and I bring it home and I end up eating it all. So at this point, Mike couldn't help himself. Marlon, I'm 67 years old. I don't need to show America what an a-hole you are. Why don't we just be friends? At which point I'm like livid because it took so long to get to this moment. And so the dinner ends, we go back to New York, and Brando and I don't speak very much after that. We had one more final conversation. And that conversation, he calls me up and he said, you play the stock market. And I said, well, I don't have much money. I have to play a little bit. He said, well, let me give you a tip. What's that? It's a company called Apple. I said, I never heard of it. He said, trust me, you will. So I go back and tell Wallace about the conversation, and he said, you're going to buy the stock. I said, are you crazy? Why would I take a stock tip from a guy who can't decide what flavor ice cream he wants? Anyway, that's one that got away for sure. So I could go on, but what I'd like to do also is hear from you about things you're interested in, and then I could elaborate a little bit more. So Rabbi, if you want to...
Yeah, I have a number of questions here, and thank
Sure.
you. I've heard many of these stories or read many of these stories in the book, and I love the way in which you go into detail. And one of the things that's fascinating, you alluded to this earlier, in the early days, it's not like you could just look at what was online in the news. You actually physically got on airplanes and went places to get the newspaper. Right, to figure out what the stories were that were happening around the country.
Yeah, it was something we called airport roulette, where what you do is you had to, so like I said, the place was very competitive, and a lot of the articles and news stories came from the New York Times. So in order to find out what's going on outside, you literally go to the airport and you just fly around and read newspapers, and you go from town to town until you see a story that's worthy, and you stay.
It's amazing. So a number of questions that people have shared. One is, why did 60 Minutes succeed, or why has 60 Minutes succeeded for so long with so many different people across so many different eras? And as the follow-up to that too is, how do you think the younger generation, which gathers and consumes their information differently, how does that bode for the future of 60 Minutes and similar types of programming?
Well, yeah, I know it's a great question and complicated. When I began at 60 Minutes, there was it was important to know how to tell a story. One of the stories, we joke about now, I'm down here in Florida for a little while, is Driving While Old. And that was a story that Harry Reasoner had done. And what it basically is these people get to be old and they shouldn't be on the road anymore. They can't see, some of them can't even see over the wheel. However, if you take their license away, you basically destroy their lives. They can't see their friends, they can't go to the grocery, they can't play golf. So what do you do if you're a judge? So Harry did this story called Driving While Old. So on one hand, these people could be a menace on the road. On the other hand, you'll be destroying their life if you take away the license. So the story is playing to two people watching the show at the same time. Take their license away. No, you can't. You got to keep them. And it's called a food fight. And so you get two people agreeing or disagreeing, but that's what creates the conversations in the living room, creates the interest. It's a shared experience about watching a show. It works on a lot of levels. And Don understood that. And he would do a story, for example, another story we did back then is Not in My Neighborhood. And this is a story about these group homes that were getting, they want the group homes to be in normal neighborhoods, not to be separated out of society, but to be mainstreamed. And a lot of people with liberal persuasion felt this is really, really important. We want them to be mainstream. We want them to be in residence, but not in my neighborhood because they're worried about the value of their properties going down. So again, Dan Rather did this extraordinary story where you see the both sides of it. Then ultimately you go into the group home, you see that these people are really nice people and will not diminish the property, but are just really interesting and important to have in your neighborhood to the point where you'd want them in your neighborhood. So the story goes kind of almost like a full circle. You kind of understand why people would worry about their property values, but at the end, you also understand how important as a society it is to have these people all within your residence, and all that in 12 minutes. And so that was the trick of 60 in those days. And I think to answer your second part of the question, the young people, and again, without trying to generalize too much, but I think the art of storytelling is less important than providing them with information, giving them basic information. The Dinner with Andre, I don't think would be a movie that would ever be made today, because people will not sit there and listen to this, two people having a conversation. And I'm understand. One point I was sort of a little bit angry about it, but it's kind of like saying, well, the fashions of the 60s and 70s, why aren't people buying them in 2020, 2021? Fashions change. The way you tell stories change. There's an involvement in the way people are taking in information. So the great writers, we were down in Key West and we visited Ernest Hemingway's home, and you see the way the unfolding of that story, occurs. The stories that he wrote, and you don't see many writers doing that today. I mean, forget about someone like Thomas Wolfe, Look Homeward Angel. That book, forget it. That would have been on the junk pile a long time ago. So fashions change. And I think the way 60 Minutes is evolving away from some of those stories I just mentioned into a different category.
It's interesting when you think about the 12-minute segments versus the however many, what's the number of characters in a tweet, and somewhere in between. How do you make sure you're capturing both audiences?
Right.
Another question that someone raised is that the word toxic sounds descriptive of the culture at 60 Minutes. Why did you stay? And then also, why did you go back?
Sure. When I probably stayed with Wallace because I was ambitious. I was learning from the master of the times. And I thought that whatever abuse I was getting was just part of the job description. I mean, I looked at the other members of his team. It was like a MASH unit. You'd walk by some of the other producers' offices. Some had bad backs. They would be making phone calls, literally laying on the floor. Another one had ulcers that he nicknamed Myron, which was Mike's real name. And so I think all of us were putting up with this behavior. And because we were working for an incredible show, we're working for a genius who is, I could say probably now looking back, was a real abuser. And as I wrote in my book, if I was a woman instead of a man, I'm not sure I would have been able to put up with what he did, the snapping of the bra straps and feeling, like entitled to smack a woman's bottom who walks by his office. He probably today would have been let out in handcuffs. But it was a different period of time back then. And in terms of why I decided to go back, it is still the greatest loudspeaker on television in terms of what you could bring to an audience. When you call up somebody and say you're from 60 Minutes, your calls get returned, you get answers, they treat you in a different way. And if you're a reporter, it's a great ticket to sort of to exploring the planet. And you could also really make changes because people pay attention, maybe a little less so now, but people pay attention to what's on 60 Minutes, and you could really institute change.
Thank you. Could you share with us any times or any times that the fact that you're Jewish influenced whether or not you told a story or how you told it? Anytime that played into the experience?
Yeah, back then, Wallace was Jewish, Safer was Jewish, Hewitt was Jewish, senior producer Phil Scheffler was Jewish. And so it wasn't like we were lacking, but everybody was very conscious. Even though we were pro-Israel, you wanted to also make sure that you were a reporter. And the person who was really called out on this the most was really Mike Wallace. People described him as a self-hating Jew because he would do a tough story about Israel, but he also would do his tough story on Yasser Arafat, and that was Mike's MO. He treated both fairly, but maybe harshly. So when he asked Menachem Begin, what is the difference between the Begin who was an Irgun fighter and Yasser Arafat of today? I mean, I thought Begin was going to jump out of his chair and strangle him. But Mike was just asking a good question and a fair question, and you would think that he'd be able to answer that. So the story I told earlier about Ashraf Marwan, I really wanted to believe all those Israelis who were telling me he was their greatest spy and there was no way that they could have ever been fooled. But at the end of the day, I objectively looked at it and I think they were fooled. So, it doesn't detract from me being a Yid, but you look at things fairly.
Yeah. You spoke about interviews you did in the middle of a geopolitical crisis and stated that if 60 Minutes were the same character now, someone would be in Moscow interviewing Putin. Do you ever have concerns about, do you ever have concerns about what you do, that what you're doing might cause harm, or that what you did might cause harm to a situation like that or elsewhere in the world?
Sure, but that's assuming that trying to get an interview with Putin would cause harm. And what you're not trying to cause harm. What you're trying to do is provide information. And there was a great, it wasn't 60 Minutes, but great Ted Koppel Nightline that he did in South Africa, where he was talking to, I think it was Bishop Tutu and the ruling party of South Africa, the president of South Africa. I think it was Botha at the time. And he put them together on the screen the way you and I are on the screen right now. And he actually, for the first time, had them talking. And it led to to, great things. And so I think information, when you get people talking and learning about the other side, right now, Putin, for example, is being painted as a crazy person, food testers, he's out of his mind, the people are going to overthrow him. But if you get there and you find that the situation, in fact, is much different, that would help people understand the situation a little bit more.
Great, thank you. Another question from one of our participants is, you spoke about not airing a story unless you could confirm it with the source. What is your reaction to news shows now airing stories with the line, XYZ News has not verified the story, or EFG News has reported, with the implication that XYZ has not verified?
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, I saw the other day, there was somebody who showed a group of tanks, and they said, we're showing you this video, but we can't verify where it came from. It's like, what are you doing? And I've often said, I say this to journalism classes sometimes I speak at, I regard some of the best stories that I've ever done to be stories that have never been on the air, which is after I've researched it, I look at it, and I don't care that I invested a month in it and look at it. If it's not there, it's not there, and I just kill the story. And there was a story which on when I was at ABC, somebody had brought us a story about Pan Am 103, and the reasons it was shot down, saying that the target was 6 Mossad agents who were on board, 6 CIA and Mossad agents who were on board the plane, and they wanted to bring the plane down. And the person who was revealing it to us claimed to be an ex-Mossad agent himself. So I went off campus and I checked him out. In fact, he wasn't a Mossad agent. He was a fired El Al security officer with a bad record. And I came back and told my boss, and I said, we're not running the story. He said, what are you talking about? Time Magazine is going to be putting it on the cover. I said, great, let them. The only choice I'm giving you is, do you want Chinese food or Italian food for lunch? That's the only choice you get. And we ended up not running it. Time put it on the cover, and then a week later they had to retract it. And the coda to the story is something like 20 years later, I'm at a friend's attorney's retirement party, and I see the guy, and I start talking to him. What are you doing? And he's wearing an American flag on his lapel. That's always a sign or something. And so and the lawyer comes over to me and he says, "How do you know this guy?" And I tell him the story, and he starts laughing. And I said, "Well, how do you know him?" He said, "Oh, I got him off federal fraud charges in Manhattan." I said, "Oh, okay." So I think I made the right call at the time.
Well, so there are, so many stories over so many years that are, introduced. I know you don't go into the full story in your book, but really giving us the flavor for all of these moments. And I'm sure there were a lot of things that didn't make it into the book. But one of our participants is wondering if you kept a diary all those years to remember so many details. I'm sure some of it clearly is recorded on film. Some of the on air, but the behind.
Some of it is, yeah. In fact, there was a story, producer's favorite story, and I talk about something, and sure enough, it was there on film that actually helped fill out that particular story. But what I would do is, during some of these extraordinary tense meetings, I would try to. It's like some people sketch. Doodles or sketch, I would write out stories. Part of it was I wanted to maintain my ability to write because I started off as a writer at Cornell and I was a newspaper reporter. So I never thought of them as diaries. It was really more short stories. Like the Brando story, for example, I wrote, after that experience, I wrote literally like a short story, something that could almost stand on its own. After I got back from Pakistan, I wrote about that. The Marwan stuff, I wrote about that. So these things, and I never really planned to put it in a book. I just was keeping it as stuff to remember and also to keep my practice up in being able to write out stories. But eventually I just looked at them and I said, I think I could organize this into something. And that's what we got today.
Thank you. What story would you say you're most proud of stories that aired, and perhaps what story do you wish never aired but did?
So the stories that I'm there are really two. Used to be one, now it's two. But the two stories I'm probably most proud of was the story I did on the Stock Act in about 8, 9 years ago. And this was a story that allowed congressmen and senators to trade on inside information that they learned in congressional hearings and then benefit from it on the stock exchange. And we exposed one House member who got a briefing from Hank Paulson that the economy was about to crash and then went out and shorted stocks immediately after the meeting. And then we exposed a number of other people to do that. The bill was called the Stock Act, had 13 sponsors when we began it. By the time we finished, it had 224 in the House. The entire U.S. Senate was behind it. Barack Obama spoke about it in the State of the Union. And when it was ultimately signed into law, I was given a front row seat next to Fred Wertheimer, Common Cause, for the signing. And I said to myself, my God, this is what journalism is all about. Until 6 months later, through voice vote, Congressman Cantor got the Congress to rescind the whole thing. So it was like, you do this story, there's big sturm, people are angry, and I write about in my book, if you're interested, about the people who are the most current violators of the Stock Act, who shorted stocks when they were given briefings on the coming COVID pandemic. They were briefed on it and then immediately dumped stock. And they only, by the way, they only told their very, very top people who gave them money about it. The rest of the public, they said, oh, everything will be fine, everything will be fine. And meanwhile, they're dumping their portfolios. So, once again now the Stock Act has come into view. And Nancy Pelosi at first rejected it. And now suddenly, because of the outcry, I think it's going to end up passing once again. We'll see what happens to it ultimately. The second story really was about the opiate epidemic and how Congress neutered the powers of the DEA at the height of the epidemic. And we did that collaboratively with the Washington Post. And I like doing these collaborations, first to, working with the great reporters at the Post who have enormous expertise. But more importantly, when 60 Minutes and the Washington Post hit a subject, people sit up and pay attention. And they did in this case. And it ultimately led to the guy who was the architect of the neutering of the DEA being fired from a job he had been given by Donald Trump to be the new drug czar. And that story ended up becoming the most single award-winning piece in the history of 60 Minutes. And in terms of stories that I did that I regret doing, I as I said, I was always pretty careful about stuff. I had one story. I'll give you an example of another one that I came back to my office in Washington one day, and I was 60 Minutes now. I'm in Washington. And there was a brown envelope, and it was I opened it up, and it was the Majestic 12 document, which is basically the document about the UFO that crashed in Roswell and the cover-up and all the people involved. It was a beautiful document. Whoever did this document, it was perfect. And I read it and then put it back in the envelope and sat there, meditated for a minute, then read it again. And then I began to work it and found out that the typeface was wrong for the period of time when this document was supposedly written, that some of the people on the distribution list had been in fact dead. Remember, there's no internet here. You have to do this at the Library of Congress. And it was so sophisticated, they actually put a document in the Library of Congress during my search that duplicated or mirrored the document I had. So I put it back in the envelope, and my next door neighbor at work was the BBC, and I mentioned this to him. And he said, oh, I'd love to do a feature story on it. So he did, but he took it as if this is the real thing, and it exploded around the world. And I get a phone call from Hewitt and Wallace, kid, you got to get on this story. By the way, they never called you by your name. It's always kid or young America. Kid, you got to get on the story. And I said, I've had the story for weeks. There's nothing to it. And what are you talking about? The BBC is reporting. And I said, yeah, they're going to be wrong. Don't worry about it. And I went through my reporting with them and they understood it. Later, when it got to be a little popular, the FBI looked into it, and for the first time, I have seen the FBI put on a document. So they planted on this document that I had on my desk the word bogus, and I've never seen that before from the FBI. You're not credible. They have some polite, language. Bogus is what they put it on. So I felt pretty good about that, passing on that one.
Thank you. As you probably can imagine, a number of folks who are joining us today are originally New Yorkers, and
Sure.
Many of us still proudly consider ourselves New Yorkers, myself included. But one participant believes it's possible she might have gone to high school with you and is wondering where you went to high school.
Francis Lewis High School.
Okay, so I think that answers her question. She went to Bronx High School of Science.
I couldn't get in. I couldn't get in.
And then a question to what you're doing now. So and you may see this on the screen. Are you retired now? You write about how difficult it is for top correspondents to retire, and do you find similar challenges?
Yeah, I've been working since I've been 16. So I've been working continuously for 50 years. And the mistake I see a lot of people doing is they want to either stay on the same job for a longer period of time or move or keep working. I'm enjoying this period, which is almost like a sabbatical for me. And I had a Neiman Fellowship, which was extraordinary in the mid-career, and that was a great thing to recharge. But what I'm doing now is I have a number of projects that are interesting to me. I can't talk about them yet, but I'm not rushing to do something. I'm taking my time before embracing something else. But I'm not going to just sit around and do nothing.
Maybe there's a ticking clock too, just like the 60 Minutes too, a follow-up.
Yes.
I want to thank you, Ira, for spending the time with us today, and also for sharing all the behind the scenes. It was really fascinating, and I think just especially as we are in this era when people talk about fake news and question where its sources are, and to know the kind of time and energy that goes into those amazing stories, 12 minutes, but days, weeks, months, even longer sometimes, producing the stories that we get to enjoy on air. Really is
I also want
incredible.
to say that well, thank you so much for having me. But what the publisher did was quite extraordinary. They reduced the price of the book on Kindle to $3. So if you go on Amazon, you could pick the book up for $3 and actually get a 75-cent credit. And it launched it back to be the #1 seller in the world of TV. So that's certainly one way to go. There's an audio book where I read the first few chapters. I didn't read the whole thing because friends said you have too much of a New York accent. Go figure. And then, of course,
I think some of us would enjoy that.
Yeah, some of us would, but you got to sell the book, I guess, in Utah and other places. So, so there's a number of places to pick it up and enjoy it. And thank you again for having me. And
you're welcome, and thank you for being flexible with schedules and being able to join us. We're so twins. I want to thank you again, and I put the link once more into the chat for people to purchase the book through our WHC Mitzvah Mall. So we also do some good through the purchase of the book. I encourage you to find independent booksellers to support as well, especially for those of us who like to hold a book in our hands. Although I have my iPad here too. As long as we're reading and we keep reading and keeping our minds active and engaged. And that's why this is such a wonderful opportunity. Again, Ira, thank you so much for being with us today. And so glad that everybody was able to join us. And we look forward to hopefully next time you're in Washington or sometime when you're in Washington, being able to continue the conversation. Really so wonderful to be with you today.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.